All right, ladies and gentlemen, you are locked on Falcons. I'm your host, Aaron Freeman. And on today's episode, we are talking about the lack of updates on when Calvin Ridley, as well as swing tackle Matt Gono, will return to the Falcons lineup. And the latter conversation about Gono will get us into a conversation about the future of the Falcons offensive line, particularly the right tackle, as well as left guard position. And we'll also be touching upon the possibility that the Falcons will have a new punter on Sunday and how that will affect them in the matchup against the Jacksonville Jaguars.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, guys, you know me. I'm Aaron Freeman. I've been covering the Falcons for many years, formerly at falcfans.com, RIP, still going strong. However, on Twitter at Falcons, putting up weekly content over at the Falcaholic, the SB Nation website for the Atlanta Falcons, and also the host of this preeminent Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, right here on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And before we get into today's episode of Locked On Falcons, I want to thank all of you that make Locked On Falcons your first listen each and every day. Of course, Locked On Falcons is free and available on a variety of podcast platforms, including Apple, Odyssey, Google, and Spotify, and now also available on YouTube, where you can see this handsome face staring at you every single day, every single evening on the Locked On Falcons YouTube channel. So make sure you subscribe. And when you do, make sure you give us that like, that thumbs up, as well as leave a comment on what you think I could do better or potentially do worse at, because I'm the best at everything. Anyway, today's episode of Locked On Falcons will feature a conversation about Calvin Ridley and an update on his status, which is essentially no update on his status. We'll talk a little bit about a similar issue that the Falcons are dealing with Matt Gono, a player that we've kind of not talked about a bunch over the last couple of months, given that he's on the PUP list. And we'll talk about what that means for his future, as well as the future of the Falcons offensive line. That will sort of get us into a conversation. And that will put me in a place that I don't like to be, which is back on Kaleb McGary Island, defending Kaleb McGary on this podcast, which seems to be a weekly occurrence on this podcast. But, that will get us into a conversation about the future of the Falcons offensive line. We spent a lot of yesterday's episode talking about the center position with Matt Hennessy and, his struggles against the Patriots, especially. And today we'll spread the love to the other much maligned offensive lineman on the Falcons front with Kaleb McGary and, of course, the incomparable Jalen Mayfield. So we'll talk quite a bit about the future of that position. And, we'll wrap up today's episode talking about the fact that punter Dustin Colquitt is going on the reserve COVID list, was placed there Monday, and sort of, that likely puts him out for Sunday's matchup, and sort of what that means potentially for the matchup, given that we know the Falcons punting situation has not been particularly good and may wind up, be going with their third punter of the season this weekend, which, unfortunately has been a problem for the team. But, maybe that means that the Falcons will do what they did, 2 years ago when they went through like 4 punters in the 2019 season and then wound up drafting a punter in the 2020 draft. And Sterling Hofferter got injured this past summer, so he's gone. Still holding out the hope that the Falcons will come to their senses and re-sign him. But, that probably means that the Falcons are destined to draft a punter next year. And at least there's seemingly generational punter talent, in the college ranks if he chooses to come out of San Diego State. So we'll be talking a lot more about the draft today, if you aren't catching the hint, I guess, than we normally do on this podcast. But without further ado, let's sort of talk about the lack of updates on Calvin Ridley. And Arthur Smith, the Falcons head coach, in his Monday presser basically said he had no updates for Calvin Ridley or Matt Gono's potential return. And Ridley, of course, is now eligible to return from the non-football injury list that he was placed just after that Panthers game a couple of weeks ago. And essentially you have to be on that list for at least 3 games before you can return. And that has been the case with the Saints, Cowboys, and Patriots games now being played for the Falcons. And obviously, there is no rush, at least from my end, or any pressure for Calvin Ridley to come back. I'm sure maybe there's others out there that would disagree on that notion, but, I think he should be allowed to take all the time that he needs before he returns. And it sounds like the team is going to be supportive of that, as they have shown their support throughout, the last couple of weeks. And hopefully, Calvin Ridley will, come back stronger whenever he does decide to come back. And hopefully it's sooner rather than later. And not only because that indicates that Calvin Ridley's, mental well-being has, taken a positive turn, but also because it obviously benefits the Falcons on the football field. And, it's the best of both worlds. It's a win-win, as I sort of see it. So we'll see how it goes. But, as is the case, I'm going to make the assumption for the time being that Calvin Ridley is out indefinitely. And we'll sort of just have to wait and see when he returns to practice, which he, again, technically is now eligible to do, but time will tell when that actually occurs. But I'm going to assume that it's probably not going to happen later this week when the Falcons take the practice field on Wednesday. But obviously, if and when there is an update on that, from the team or Calvin Ridley himself, then, you'll hear an update from me. So with that being said, let's talk about Matt Gono a little bit. And I've been kind of making a similar assumption in regard to Matt Gono being out indefinitely. And that assumption has gone as far as to basically assume that he will not be returning to the team's roster or lineup at any point this year. I'm assuming at this point in time that eventually Calvin Ridley will return, but I am also aware of the possibility that that may not be the case with 7 games remaining in this 2021 season. And Matt Gono, as I mentioned earlier, is on the physically unable to perform list, or the PUP list, with an undisclosed injury, although the closest that we know of it is based off of him being cited entering training camp, or reporting the training camp back in July with a neck brace on. So we assume it's a neck or head related injury. And basically the rules of the PUP list are that a player must sit out the first 6 weeks of the regular season. And then there's a 5-week window for when that player can return to practice. And obviously, coming off of the heels of this week 11 game, there's that 5-week window is sort of essentially expired after this Patriots game. And I'm assuming then that indicates that, because there's no indication that Matt Gono is going to return to practice this week, at least as of yet, that we will probably not see him return to practice at any point this season. And again, that's been kind of the assumption I've been making all along, given the severity of and the risk involved with neck injuries in football, and such a high contact sport that players, as we know, are prone to head injuries and whatnot. So we'll see if anything changes in that regard, but that's been the assumption I've been making all along. And I have a lot more to say about Matt Gono's status and how it relates to ongoing roster issues that the Falcons are dealing with, particularly on the offensive line. And that will sort of lead us into the place that I don't like to be, my least favorite island on the planet, which is Kaleb McGary Island, where I'm defending the much maligned Falcons right tackle once more. And that will sort of get us into a bigger conversation about the future of not only that right tackle position, but as well as other positions along the Falcons offensive line. But before we get into that, guys, I want to thank you for making Locked On Falcons your first listen each and every day. And of course, I have recommendations for what your second listen should be. And of course, if you're a fan of Atlanta/Georgia sports, then you, of course, can check out a whole host of shows related to Atlanta and Georgia sports here on the Locked On Podcast Network, including the Locked On Hawks, Locked On Braves, and Locked On Bulldogs podcasts. And of course, Locked On Hawks, Locked On Braves, and Locked On Bulldogs can all be found free and available on a variety of podcast platforms, including Apple, Odyssey, Google, and Spotify. And you can also find Locked On Braves and Locked On Bulldogs specifically on YouTube. So go subscribe to those shows and check them out as your second listen, coming up on the heels of your first listen here on Locked On Falcons. So let's talk a little bit more about Matt Gono, because we haven't really discussed him since Final Cuts, in part due to the assumptions I mentioned earlier, that we would not really have a need to talk about him until much later in the season. Now we've arrived at that point later in the season. And at the time when we talked about him during Final Cuts, the discussion was surrounded by my misconception at the time that he would potentially be a cap casualty at the end of camp, because we knew the Falcons, cap space was limited and they needed to find quick and easy ways to create cap space. And I think they wound up restructuring Deion Jones's contract, if I recall correctly, in order to create that cap space. But at the time I thought, oh, maybe they might cut Matt Gono, but they weren't able to do that because um, due to the injury that he had suffered and the fact that he was a restricted free agent, and the way that those tenders work is that basically they become guaranteed for injury once a player signs them. And so essentially, a player like Gono, what guaranteed for injury means that if, you get hurt and you have a contract, you're still going to get your money. So because Gano was a restricted free agent this past offseason, of course, he will be an unrestricted free agent this upcoming offseason. And, unfortunately, the way I've sort of felt about the impact of this injury that he's suffered this summer at some point, I want to say it was in either late May or early June, potentially could end and derail what to me was a very promising career here in Atlanta. And obviously, I can't necessarily predict the future, but, I've been skeptical for a while that the Falcons would eventually re-sign Matt Gono, next offseason, even one as talented as Gono is in my eyes, because essentially they've only really seen him for a handful of days and or weeks from OTAs. And I don't know if that's enough for this team to go off of to, potentially pay the premium that you would need to pay in order to keep Matt Gono as a swing tackle next offseason, when they could potentially bolster that with, players with less injury question marks or whatever the case may be. And then you couple that with the fact that, a player that the Falcons essentially resigned to replace Matt Gono at the beginning of training camp was Jason Spriggs. And he looked decent in his lone on-field start versus the Dolphins earlier this season. And I imagine that the Falcons, will probably prioritize, if they were going to bring back any of the impending free agent tackles between Gono and Spriggs, my guess would be Spriggs would probably be prioritized of that group. And, you couple that with the potential that the Falcons could wind up drafting a tackle next April in the 2022 draft, due to my belief that, they will probably have a high degree of confidence, if I would term an overconfidence, in left guard Jalen Mayfield to continue developing. Now, I personally don't share their confidence or that potential confidence in Mayfield's development, and I'll explain later on today's episode why I don't have that. But it does make sense for the Falcons to potentially look at, of their 5 starting, offensive linemen, to maybe look at offensive tackle as at least being much more of a need in the immediate future, because presuming that Kaleb McGary is not going to get his 5th-year option exercise next offseason, which I don't think he will. 2022 is going to mark the final year of his rookie contract. So he's potentially a free agent after the 2023 season. You're also looking at Jake Matthews getting up there in age. He'll be 30 next year, and he's signed through the 2023 season. And you're looking at a situation where you've got to start thinking about potentially replacing him with, or at least adding an heir apparent to potentially replace him down the road. And so if the Falcons were to, say, use a mid-round pick, like a 3rd or 4th round pick, on more of a developmental offensive tackle, you could definitely see that player being at least brought in to potentially not only man the swing tackle position immediately, but potentially be groomed not only as a replacement for Kaleb McGary in 2023, should the Falcons not re-sign him. And I don't think currently Kaleb McGary is on track to earn a second contract here in Atlanta, but also be in the mix to potentially replace Jake Matthews further down the line. And all that, to me, doesn't really leave a lot of room for Matt Gono here in Atlanta in the future. And I think that's a shame, because Gono was a player that I thought with further development could potentially be penciled in as that Jake Matthews heir apparent at the left tackle position, because I do think he has the athleticism and the potential skill set to play left tackle at a reasonably high level in the National Football League. And we saw that on display at times last year, going up against players like DeMarcus Lawrence and Nick Bosa. Joey Bosa, when he was an injury replacement for Kaleb McGary last year, and did a really good job staying in front of those guys' speed rush. Now, he did not do as good a job against Khalil Mack and Shaq Barrett in other games last year as a replacement starter. But, I thought showed a lot of promise that, again, with development, with, cleaning up some of the technical aspects of his game, he would potentially be a plug and play starter at one of those tackle positions, not only as a potential, insurance policy in the event that a player like Kaleb McGary doesn't further his development, but also as sort of a secret stash in terms of a Jake Matthews heir apparent. And, this is related somewhat to what we discussed on yesterday's episode in regard to the Falcons rebuilding their roster, particularly on the offensive line. But, you know, when you look around the league, most left tackles are first round picks or former first round picks. 20 of the current starting left tackles, and I'm including a couple of guys that are injured or barely have played this year, like Mekhi Becton and Taylor Decker and Ronnie Stanley in current NFL starting left tackles. But 20 of the current starting left tackles in the NFL are former first round picks. And then you have like 5 more, depending on how you want to count guys. Second round picks, like is Elton Jenkins a starting left tackle because he's technically replacing a 4th round guy in David Bakhtiari, so I don't know if he counts. But there's at least 5 more second round picks that are also starting left tackle. So you're talking about almost 80% of the league has used premium picks to fill that left tackle position in over the last 10 15 years, going back to, I guess, Andrew Whitworth is the oldest guy, going back to the 2000 season, something ridiculous, like 2005 or whatever it was when he came into the league. And so one of the selling points I've made about Matt Gono over the last year or so is, given and why he's so valuable and why he's such a key in critical ingredient to the future of the Falcons offensive line, is because he essentially, if he does turn into a viable, competent starter for you, he's essentially saving you from having to use a top 50 pick at some point in the near future to find that replacement for Jake Matthews, or even to find that upgrade over Kaleb McGary. Because, if you're looking at the right tackles in the league, it's not as many first round picks. There's only 12 starting right tackles in the league that are first round picks, and there's 6 second rounders, but that's still then more than half, almost 60% of the league has, starting right tackles that are, top picks in the top 2 rounds of the NFL draft. And essentially, being able to plug and play with an undrafted free agent like Matt Gono saves you that top 50 pick from having to invest that resources into a potential starting tackle at some point in the future. And we saw the similar dynamic happen with Ryan Trader when the Falcons were able to turn that undrafted free agent into a viable starter for, basically 5-6 years here in Atlanta. And that basically meant that the Falcons didn't have to use any of their premium picks from 2014 when they drafted Jake Matthews in the first round until 2019. That's 5 drafts when they drafted Kaleb McGary, where they didn't have to invest in an offensive tackle, and that allowed them to invest in other areas. Unfortunately for us, some of those other investments didn't necessarily go the way that we had wanted them to do with some of those topics. Although, again, I think when we talk about Thomas Dimitrov's drafting record, I think generally speaking, with some obvious exceptions, his first and second round picks were generally good picks. So I'm not complaining too much about that. But that being said, basically what that means is, if you're in the camp of we have to get an upgrade over Kaleb McGary at the right tackle position, you're essentially in the camp of you probably are looking at the Falcons using a first round pick on a tackle at some point, either in the 2022 draft or the 2023 draft, depending on how much, of a leash, I guess, how much, slack you're willing to cut. Are you willing to give Kaleb McGary another bite at the apple as the starting right tackle, in 2022, so that you will potentially hold off on using that first round pick on the tackle in 2023? And again, this is related to the topic that we discussed on Monday's episode, which is, how long of a timeline is it going to take for the Falcons to rebuild if they're going to have to essentially redo a lot of these Dimitrov draft selections, starting with potentially a Kaleb McGary this year or next year. With some of these earlier round picks. And those are early round picks that the Falcons won't be able to invest in pass rushers or corners or running backs or quarterbacks or, wide receivers or whatever the case may be. Some of these other positions that I think a lot of people look at as potentially pressing needs as well. And so this is why, I find myself back on Kaleb McGary Island, the only resident on this island, because when I, look at last week's game, obviously I think Kaleb McGary had the worst rep of the game in terms of that sack he gave up to Matt Judon. But, outside of that play and maybe one or two others, watching the film, I didn't see a whole lot from Kaleb McGary that, that was troubling to me, at least certainly when we compare his performance in that Patriots game to left guard Jalen Mayfield, as well as center Matt Hennessy, which we discussed at length on yesterday's episode. And so it's very lonely on this Kaleb McGary Island, and I don't like it here. The water sucks. There's very little food here. And to be clear, like, I'm not stuck on this island because I want to be here. I'm stuck on this island not because I think Kaleb McGary's good. I just think he gets probably a lot more flack than he essentially deserves whenever he messes up. For example, this Patriots game, we're like, yeah, it was a terrible rep against Matt Judon, but outside of that one rep, again, not going to sit here and say Kaleb McGary played well against the Patriots, particularly when it came to run blocking. But as a pass protector, like, outside of that one play, there wasn't a whole lot that I watched and said, oh God, Kaleb McGary's the worst, as particularly in comparison to Mayfield and Hennessy, who I saw mess up a lot more frequently. But when they mess up, you essentially hear crickets in terms of people, basically jumping ship on those guys. And I get why that is. They're relatively young, they're inexperienced, and essentially they're going to get the benefit of the doubt whenever they make mistakes that because people tend to operate off of the fallacy that, with more time, with more reps, young guys will improve. And that is generally true, but isn't necessarily as broadly true as I think a lot of people assume, especially when the struggles that young guys are having are related to physical deficiencies. And we discussed at length some of those physical deficiencies that Matt Hennessy has, which have led to some of his struggles this year. And, when I look at Jalen Mayfield and his struggles, those to me, much like Kaleb McGary's issues, are related to physical deficiencies. And, we can talk about, we're talking about Calvin Ridley earlier this episode. Like, one of the criticisms I've heard for folks, in regard to Calvin Ridley is like, oh, well, he doesn't win on contested catches. And it's like, yeah, because he's never won on contested catches. And this is a great example of a physical limitation that doesn't really improve with time and with reps. The knock on Calvin Ridley coming out of Alabama was he couldn't jump and he's skinny, right? And while you can sit there and say, well, he can do calf lifts and eat more Built Bars to bulk up or whatever the case may be, and that should resolve those issues, that typically is rare in the NFL. It's not necessarily common to see guys transforming their bodies at age 23, 24, 25. Typically, when you're looking at football players transforming their bodies, it happens at 18, 19, 20 in college, as opposed to at the pro level. The NFL is more about refining what you already are, not necessarily changing what you are into something else. And while I won't sit here and say it never happens in the NFL, it certainly happens on occasion, but relatively speaking, it's rare. And so therefore, in the case of a player like Calvin Ridley, expecting him to be sort of the exception to the rule doesn't make a ton of sense. And McGary is another great example of this because his struggles are related to lack of athleticism and lack of slow feet, because he struggles against speed, and that was on display against Matt Judon. And because of that, normally you would say, okay, if you struggle against speed, you can use your punch to sort of stymie or slow down that speed rush. But because Kaleb McGary has shorter arms, he has to generally not be as aggressive as a puncher, because it will lead to him being a little bit more overextended and only compound that, slow feet issue that he has. And that often gives a decisive advantage to any speed rusher that can effectively, beat him with speed. And despite that issue, however, and part of the reason why I continue to remain the only resident on Kaleb McGary Island is that he has, despite that issue, has held his own at times against quality speed rushers. Players like Shaq Barrett in week 2, Chase Young in week 4, who he shut down in that game. Always got to bring that up. And then, coming off of the COVID list against Carolina, held his own against Brian Burns and Hassan Reddick. I thought going into that game that, much like the Falcons did with Jason Spriggs in that Dolphins game the previous week, which giving him help as many possible times as humanly possible on every single pass rushing rep and never leaving on an island, the Falcons, for the most part, left Kaleb McGary on an island against Brian Burns and Hassan Reddick. And he more than held his own in that game. He got beat a couple of times, but it wasn't to any huge degree, certainly not to the degree that I was expecting. And that's now twice, going to the Washington game as well as, that Carolina game where I expected Kaleb McGary to really struggle in that game, and he did not struggle. And, the point is that, like, you don't hear those things from people, don't talk about his improvement, but yet we'll sit here and build up Jalen Mayfield because, PFF is giving a weird, highly grade to him for his run blocking in garbage time against, the Cowboys or the Saints or whoever it was, Cowboys in garbage time. So, we're praising that. We're going out of our way. We're bending over backwards to praise that. And again, I know I come off as a Jalen Mayfield hater, but like for me, when I look at Jalen Mayfield, his limitations are also related to physical stuff. He's not a great athlete. Poor technique, slow hands, slow feet, stiff hips, short arms, all these various things. And essentially, what I said post draft was like all of McGary's issues are dialed up to 11 with Jalen Mayfield. And so, that leads to a lot of the struggles that we've seen from Jalen Mayfield, struggling against powerful defense tackles, struggling against quicker ones that will hit him with a quick swim move. We saw that a number of times in this Patriots game, where he's not even being able to lay a hand on a player. He's getting overextended because of that poor punch and poor technique and whatnot. And, because of he's even a lesser athlete than Kaleb McGary is, he struggles to adjust when he can't do that. And, relating this back to Matt Gono, he, like Jake Matthews and Chris Lindstrom as well, are the only Falcons offensive linemen on this team that really have the athleticism and flexibility that when they lose that initial engagement, as we have seen a number of times with all Falcons offensive linemen, that they have the flexibility to sort of recoil those hips, recover and reset and still win the rep, even if they lost this sort of initial engagement there. And we've seen that happen from time to time because particularly those three guys, Gono, Matthews, and Lindstrom, aren't necessarily known for their power or their physicality. And so oftentimes against determined bull rushers and whatnot, they will lose those reps. We've seen Lindstrom struggle, the guys that he struggled the most with in his career, players like Akeem Hicks and Derek Brown and Chris Jones. And this is part of the reason why Gono struggled at guard, because he had less of an opportunity to sort of reset on those things, particularly against last year against Chris Jones and that Kansas City offensive line, where guys were effective at using power. And essentially against a powerful player like that, you're not going to get an opportunity to reset and re-anchor or whatever the case may be. But, going back to Jalen Mayfield, I don't say all these things to simply write him off. I think he certainly can improve, but similar to with McGary, it's going to require a significant level of improvement to his technique, and that always takes time. And as we've seen with McGary, while McGary has made technical strides over the last 3 seasons, as I'm sure most would agree, myself included, it hasn't been at the rate that I think a lot of us are hoping for. And to me, Mayfield projects as a player that it's going to take even a slower rate because he came into the league much rawer than McGary did coming into the league. And so, the level of patience that I think people are going to have with Mayfield, I just think is a little misguided. And this is going to come off as arrogant and know-it-all-y, as, people often accuse me of being. And I won't necessarily run away from that accusation, but I will embrace, my mantle as the Falcons prophet here and go out on, to me, what is a very sturdy limb. And again, I don't say this with absolute 100% knowledge. I say this, but I can sit here and say with like, let's say 85% confidence that, people will basically be saying the similar things about Jalen Mayfield 2 or 3 years from now, as they're saying about Kaleb McGary in terms of not having progress. And I'll be sitting here and be like, yeah, I told you this 2-3 years ago, and you didn't want to listen because reasons, right? Because you just wanted to give the rookie the benefit of the doubt, or you just wanted to basically like, Aaron, you don't know everything. And it just, to me, like, this is just so obvious and so inevitable. And I'll be interested to see what the Falcons do this offseason. Again, this is why this offseason is fascinating. One reason number 412, why, this upcoming offseason is going to be fascinating. I've sort of secretly been pining over the idea that if the Falcons aren't able to get a pass rusher in round 1 or aren't able to get sort of a top end corner in round 1, I tend to veer on the side of the Falcons taking an offensive lineman. I'm a big fan of Ekwonu, the left tackle at NC State, who I think projects very well as a guard in the NFL. But I'm sure if the Falcons were to draft him, a lot of people would look at him as a potential replacement for Kaleb McGary first and foremost. And I would sit here and say, like, no, the Falcons need to plug him in at left guard and replace Jalen Mayfield in sort of in that experiment. And so I'll be curious to see if the Falcons do the thing that I hope they do, which is basically like, look, Jalen Mayfield was awesome for you to step in and, we put you in a bad spot, but we're not going to do that again. And so we're going to immediately go out there and find someone that can upgrade that left guard position. Or do the Falcons do what I think they will probably wind up doing and using a mid-round pick on a developmental offensive tackle in the hopes that, that guy's going to be able to replace Caleb McGary and essentially, give Jalen Mayfield another year to prove them right in that draft selection and ultimately try to prove me wrong. Although, as I say, with 85% confidence, I don't think I will be proven wrong in the end. So we'll sort of see how that goes. So while the rest of you guys are pining for Jordan Davis out of the nose tackle from Georgia, I'm sitting here being like, I'm all in on Anthony Rush and Ika Mekwonu for the Falcons nose tackle guard combination. So Jordan Davis plus Jalen Mayfield, you can have him. Again, I'm a fan of Jordan Davis, but not as much a fan of Jordan Davis to, go another year with Jalen Mayfield. So I'll take Anthony Rush and Ika Mekwonu, and we'll see how, that combination turns out long-term in the future. So with that being said, we'll continue today's Locked On Falcons podcast, wrapping up things by talking a little bit about the Falcons punting situation with Dustin Colquitt going on the reserve COVID list and what that means for Sunday's action against Jacksonville. But before we get there, it is the holiday week, and Thanksgiving means that football is here on Thursday, as you guys are chomping down on turkey and sides and whatnot. But what goes better with turkey? It's betting, and BetOnline has you covered this holiday season with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. BetOnline remains your number one spot for all the sports action this Thanksgiving. You got the Bears-Lions game with the Bears favored by 3.5 points on the road on Thursday. Cowboys are 7-point favorites at home versus the Raiders, and the Bills are 4.5-point favorites on the road against the Taysom Hill-led Saints. And BetOnline even has a $10,000 Thanksgiving parlay contest, which is free to enter. And if you successfully pick all the winners on Thanksgiving Day against the spread, as well as the over-under totals, you win it all. Head to the new website at betonline.ag and sign up. And when you do, make sure you use the promo code LOCKEDON. You'll get a 50% welcome bonus, which means if you deposit $500, you get $250 in free money to play with. And it's not just football. BetOnline has the pro and college hoops that you want, the NHL, boxing, UFC, and even your favorite Vegas casino games. Don't wait and take advantage of all the offers available at BetOnline, the fastest and easiest way to bet on all your favorite sports. BetOnline, they will leave you stuffed with deals this Thanksgiving. So the last news of the day is the fact that punter Dustin Colquitt went on the reserve COVID list, which means the Falcons are very likely to have a new punter come Sunday against Jacksonville. And he joins Colquitt, joins Jalen Mayfield's backup. We'll use air quotes for backup, Josh Andrews, on that COVID reserve list, as he went on that list last week. And as we saw with Kaleb McGary earlier this season, when he went on the COVID reserve list that led to him missing that Dolphins game, he was on that list for 7 days. Parker Hesse, the Falcons' fourth string tight end, who's now the third string tight end with Hayden Hurst on injured reserve, was also started the season on the reserve COVID list, and he was on that list for 9 days. And so, as I mentioned, when McGary went on that list a couple weeks ago, technically it is possible that Colquitt, if he's going on this list on Monday, means that he could play on Sunday, assuming that he's asymptomatic and he tests negative for COVID for 2 straight days. And so potentially, theoretically, you can come off that list within like 48 to 72 hours, which does mean it's possible for him to return later this week in practice and potentially be on track to play on Sunday. Although I'm not aware of how many instances that has actually occurred in the NFL this year. I'm presuming very few, because I haven't heard of many instances where that has happened. So I would err on the side of assuming once again that Colquitt will not be back until sometime next week. So he'll miss this Jaguars game. And obviously that is a concern, because the Falcons punting situation has been fairly problematic this season. Of course, Colquitt's play has improved in recent weeks and has been mostly solid these last couple of games, if you can excuse a blocked punt, which was not his fault, and it looked to be the fault of either Josh Harris or Deron Harmon in that regard with a blown block. I probably put a little bit more of it on Harmon in my eyes based off of my film study. But it also was kind of schemed up. Basically, what Dallas ran, it was a twist, and basically led to Harris having to block a guy singly, and when you're a long snapper, that's not a good position to be in. So maybe it's not anybody's particular fault in terms of blowing the block, but a good scheme by Dallas in that instance. But my assumption for now going into the Jaguars game is that Colquitt will be replaced with Cam Nislak, the player that he replaced, who was cut 2 weeks ago when he came off of injured reserve with a hamstring injury. So that's my best guess for who the Falcons will sign. Maybe they'll sign somebody else, and we might get our third punter of the last 3 months here in Atlanta. So hopefully this will not affect the matchup too much, because hopefully the Falcons will not be punting very much this weekend. We know Nislak was playing better before he got injured, but obviously was very up and down those first couple of weeks in the season. And we'll see what the Falcons offense can do against Jacksonville's defense, who have generally struggled this season, ranking currently 29th in defensive DVOA according to Football Outsiders, but their defensive performance has improved the last couple of weeks. That wasn't on display this past Sunday against the 49ers, who seemingly had very little problem marching down the field on their first 5 drives to score 5 times. But hopefully, this Jaguars defense, this matchup against Jacksonville, represents an opportunity for the Falcons to have their very own get right game, which is often the situation when opposing teams face the Falcons. And so we'll see if this Falcons offense can sort of respond this week. And obviously we'll talk more about that later this week when we do our crossover, which I'll admit right now, I don't know which day it's going to be. It's possible it could be on Wednesday, possibly could be punted till later in the week. As we normally do our crossovers on Thursday, but because of the holidays, we might have to move some stuff around. So I'll check with the higher ups on sort of when the network as a whole is going to be pushing for crossovers this week, if those are going to be Wednesday, Thursday, or Friday. So we'll see about that. And so that means it's possible that, our crossover could be on Wednesday. And so that would push the potential Q&A that I was planning on doing on Wednesday until later in the week, probably Friday. My plan right now is not to do a show Thursday. So you'll get 4 episodes this week on Wednesday and Friday. But we'll sort of see about that. And if you want to send in questions to be answered on that future Q&A, whether that's a Wednesday or Friday show, then you can do so by hitting me up on Twitter at Locked On Falcons or on Facebook at Locked On Falcons, or you can send an email to lockedonfalcons@mail.com, as well as leave a comment here on the Locked On Falcons YouTube page, channel, whatever, video, whatever you want to call it. So that's the plan moving forward, guys. We'll see sort of how these things interact, and we'll just sort of have to see what the Falcons future is along the offensive line, as well as a punter, because right now there is a potentially generational punter at San Diego State that is killing it, and I think Football Outsiders has the Falcons dead last in their punting metric, looking at special teams DVOA as the worst punting team in the league this year. And so I think there's going to be incentive for the Falcons to, potentially upgrade that spot this offseason, and whether they do that in the draft, we'll see. And, based off of history, you're probably going to use a day 2 pick on a punter. So that also factors into the potential question marks and concerns this offseason. So it's a lot of moving parts with the Falcons as we head, not only for the last 7 games of this regular season, but potentially looking forward, what this team and what this roster is going to look like 6 months from now. So obviously we're going to have it covered here on the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, right here on the Locked On Podcast Network, guys. I appreciate it. I hope you have a great week, but I'll see you tomorrow.